law research at Temple University. We're here to provide expert legal analysis during the pandemic and hopefully to answer questions you may have. I'm Nicolas, professor at Indiana University School of Law. Joining me today are Rebecca Green, professor of practice of law and co-director of the election law program at William & Mary Law School, and Philip Rocco, assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University. Great welcome to both of you. Today we're talking elections. So Phil, let me start with you. Up there in Wisconsin, you were on the ground when the elections were held there in April. We saw lines of barely socially distanced people. Can you describe the legal and political background and what you observed then? And I worry that we have lost Phil.
Okay, I'm here.
He's back.
I'm back.
This is live.
All right.
So tell us about Wisconsin in April, those lines of unsocially distanced people. What are the legal political background? What did you see?
Yeah, so right after the stay-at-home order went into place, there were groups of Wisconsin voters that asked the governor to delay the election. And really what spilled out was a sort of conjunction of a few factors. You had a governor that was very uncertain about his own powers, a really obstinate legislature that was almost hostile to ballot access, deferential federal courts, and a pretty partisan state court. So immediately after the voters asked Governor Evers to do this, he sort of deferred, asked the legislature to take action to send out absentee ballots to every registered voter. The legislature said that they couldn't do that. Voters then sued in the Western District of Wisconsin. The judge there, Judge Conley, took these consolidated cases and basically said he didn't have the authority to delay the election. He did, however, delay the deadline for absentee ballots from April 7th, when the election is, till about April 13th. The RNC and the state legislature immediately appealed that ruling. And so sort of meanwhile, while that is on appeal to the Supreme Court, you have the governor, again, sort of deferring responsibility to the legislature, saying that he doesn't have the authority to delay the election, calls the legislature into special session. The legislature, and if you're familiar with Wisconsin politics, this won't surprise you at all, given the nature of the relationship between the legislature and the governor. The legislature gabbled in and gabbled out in about a minute or so, basically refused to take action. And then one day before the election, the governor signs an executive order delaying the election until June, which is then promptly contested before the state Supreme Court, which strikes it down. And then you have the same day, later the same night, the United States Supreme Court reverses Conley's delay of the absentee ballot deadline, and basically citing the Purcell principle in a 5-4 decision. So this sort of combination of factors pushes all of this pressure down onto the people who are actually administering the elections, sort of at the local level, which is where I usually am. In addition to teaching at Marquette, I volunteer as an election official. I did not ultimately do so for health reasons on the day of the election. But in Milwaukee, we had 5 of 180 polling places open. We had, sort of in the estimation of our election chief here, thousands of people who probably would have voted were they able to, actually at the polling place, didn't show up to vote. I think a lot of the political discussion of this later sort of abstracted from the reality on the ground and said, well, if you look at rates of turnout, given absentee ballots, they weren't that different from past presidential preference primaries, and sort of use that comparison to sort of basically say this is not that different from normal in terms of turnout. But if you saw things sort of on the ground on election day, you would know that this was a pretty badly botched election, and we're still sort of waiting on the sort of the specifics of the causal analysis and whether or not this, to what extent this contributed to infections. We know that there are about 26 people who were both at the election sites and developed symptoms of COVID-19 only after the election day. But this is not the sort of thing anybody wants to repeat. But I think what you see is it's not just about the procedures in the state around this, but it's also the politics. The legislature, on the one hand, not wanting to intervene or refusing to intervene. The governor sort of not being necessarily sure about his authority, and the courts sort of punting to the political branches.
And I think there was that sort of sense of dread we had as we looked at Wisconsin, thinking, come November, are we going to see that played out 50 different times or more? So Rebecca, to the non-election law specialist, one would have thought the obvious answer is you move to an absentee ballot system. Is that a switch that we can just flip? And if it does get flipped or people are considering it, how does the increased fraud argument play into that?
Yeah, so it's worth noting that in several states there already is all-mail voting. So, elections are done entirely by mail in 5 states already. In the rest of the states, we've seen a dramatic increase in early and absentee voting in the last several decades. So every state has systems in place to allow people to vote by mail. The problem is, of course, whether or not those states can cope with dramatically increased volumes of absentee voters and demand for absentee ballots and so forth. And then again, another question is whether laws must be changed to make it easier for people who are concerned about their health to vote by mail. Some states, for example, require specific kinds of excuses to allow people to vote by mail. And that list would need to be expanded in order to accommodate people who are concerned about their health. Other states have absentee voting requirements like witness requirements or even notary requirements, which will be difficult to obtain for people who live alone in a lockdown situation. And so we're seeing lots of lawsuits around the country by groups trying to make sure that absentee voting rules can accommodate the changed circumstances that we're operating in. So, for example, in Texas, in Michigan, we see some litigation about expanding access to absentee ballots. We see in Virginia, we had a case about changing witness requirements for people living alone. So there's lots of challenges to current absentee voting rules that voting rights advocates are looking into to make sure that they're as accessible as possible. As you mentioned, some have raised concerns about increased absentee voting fraud as a result of a higher demand for absentee ballots. And it's worth pointing out that these concerns are not unfounded. We have seen recently instances of absentee voting fraud causing problems, for example, in North Carolina's 9th Congressional District in the 2018 election. So it's not a totally unfounded concern, but at the same time, we know that in states that have been running all-mail elections for decades, instances of absentee voter fraud are vanishingly small, like 0.02% or some incredibly small amount. So I think it's fair to say that lawsuits reflecting both concerns, that is access to the ballot and the integrity of the process, are being filed now, and we will continue to see them in the lead up to the election. And hopefully judges and legislatures will have the opportunity to resolve these access and integrity questions ideally well in advance of the election. And I think the key is that these questions really need to be resolved quickly so that election administrators can start laying the groundwork for November's election, which is, of course, fast approaching.
Wonderful. So I don't think we can ever do one of these COVID shows without having to address the sort of the lame federalism questions that increasingly come up. So I guess civil rights laws aside, so on, elections are essentially a matter of state law, state organization. So Phil, What about the federal government? Have the administration or Congress stepped up to help the states as we start looking at the election? How are the politics playing out here?
Yeah, so I mean, thus far, Congress committed $400 million in the CARES Act to election assistance funding, and just for example, Wisconsin got $7 million from that, and they're using it to purchase things like PPE, providing absentee ballot envelopes, a lot of the important logistical aspects of elections that you don't really necessarily think about. Now, one of the interesting things about that appropriation is, unlike some of the other parts of the CARES Act, which had no matching requirements, it had a 20% match requirement for states, which meant that at least some states have found that match rate, especially as we get revised revenue estimates. That's going to potentially be onerous. Other states, Florida, I think is an interesting example, have not actually applied for their funding that they have available. And so we're not exactly clear why Governor Ron DeSantis hasn't done that. His own election commission has asked him to multiple times. He hasn't done that. So what's coming next is two potential things. First, there's a piece of legislation that Democrats might include in their package, their next package, to just waive that 20% match requirement to enable states to receive a little bit more. There's also a question about whether or not this is just, in fact, a drop in the bucket. And the Brennan Center for Justice is sort of estimated that what's really needed is something on the order of about $2 billion, especially when it comes to thinking about moving to all mail elections or mostly mail elections, keeping some polling sites open, doing things like enabling. We had some real workforce issues with election administration here in Wisconsin, and sort of providing the support for that. But I think that the politics of this will sort of founder on, or will depend on, the question of, is this seen as a sort of appropriation to state and local governments issue, or is this seen as a sort of policy change? And I think, at least within Congress, there's this sort of remaining partisan divide on the sort of vote by mail question, even though voting by mail really doesn't have significant partisan effects in elections. But there's still that perception. I think what's interesting to me is I've not necessarily seen specific demands from the major Big Seven intergovernmental organizations, the counties, cities, governors, and legislatures, on the election assistance, on beefing up election assistance particularly. However, if there is a sort of significant appropriation, they could, of course, use that funding to support legislation, or to support election administration. The real question, I think, is, to what extent is Congress going to try to exercise a heavier hand in terms of saying, this is what we think is necessary for a vote by mail election, or for an election in the midst of a pandemic? Are we going to require states to move to a certain percentage of voting by mail if they don't have it? I think probably not. But what that means is that while the politics of financing election assistance will sort of remain in Congress, the question of administration will probably remain something that we have to look at the state level. And so I would expect to just see a lot more maps in your news feed.
So let's start building up towards November. We've got a bunch of more state primaries coming up, Rebecca. Is this going to be a Zoom election? How will the candidates campaign? How do you work up your ground game in these kind of situations? The get out the votes efforts and so on. Can you try and sort of sketch that out a little bit for us?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have all the answers on that one, but it seems very likely that the ground game in this election will look unlike any in U.S. history. One of the really interesting questions that has come up is candidate ballot access petitions. So each state has rules that set the required number of signatures that a candidate has to collect to even get on the ballot. And the question is whether it's fair to place such burdens on candidates when they can't go door to door safely to or sit outside of the supermarket and interact with people. And so this has led some to look at e-signatures. So can candidates circulate these petitions online, collect signatures online? And there are efforts around the country right now in states like New York and Massachusetts to either reduce the number of signatures required, and this is actually on direct democracy petitions and candidate petitions as well, or to allow e-signatures to enable people to sign petitions remotely, or both. As far as get out the vote efforts, I think it's clear that campaigns will need to revise their voter mobilization strategies. And I think the real risk that we run is low voter participation in the election if we're unable to reach people where they are. And of course, the safety concerns that might prevent large numbers of people from casting their votes. So I think it's fair to say that campaigns are going to be working overtime to try and mobilize their voters. I think on the part of the individual voter, I think it's critically important that every eligible voter not only register to vote, which many states have made. There's been a big push, actually. 15 or 16 states have initiated online voter registration portals, so you can do it remotely. And then for people who already are registered to vote, it's incredibly important that they check the accuracy of the information that the state has in the voter registration database. So, for example, is your address updated? Have you moved recently? Lots of things you can do to make sure that they have your information down correctly. And then I think voters should also spend some time familiarizing themselves with in-person and absentee voting rules in their state. And that information will be clearly posted on the State Department of Elections website as I think probably the most reliable source. But I think people need to know that these rules may shift as legislatures and courts make adjustments to voting rules to accommodate concerns with disruption. And I think it's also important, just like on an airplane, when you sort of take care of yourself first, you should then sort of turn to others in your life who are eligible voters to make sure they have accurate information about voting in November. So I think it's going to be a team effort.
So let's talk November. There have been a few people saying, well, maybe the election might get delayed. Some states might delay. Is that possible?
Well, so states can certainly act under emergency powers to delay elections, and we've seen obviously that happen in states like Ohio because of the current pandemic. But it's important to distinguish November's election from primary elections because both the U.S. Constitution and federal law dictate dates certain by which each phase of the election must be complete. And that means states have a lot less leeway when it comes to the election in November in terms of postponing or delaying the vote or any portion of the process. What I can tell you is that every state is carefully reviewing this question and determining procedures for coping with possible election disruptions that may arise. I think Wisconsin is kind of a huge wake-up call. I think every state at this point is on notice that they need to understand what the rules are in advance. It's also important to note that this work had already started well before COVID came on the scene because of concerns about election security disruption. So states had already been sort of thinking about states and a lot of other people had already been thinking about potential for disruption in November and what systems need to be in place to prevent that. In that vein, the good news is that states do have a lot of time to prepare for worst case scenarios and put those plans in place. The bad news, as you guys were sort of talking about, is that these questions are often politicized. And so I think that the solution or the best way forward is to try to get as much agreement on what the rules are before anyone knows who they'll benefit. So the work being done, I think, is important work.
All right, well, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Let's turn to November with your sort of final predictions as to what that might look like. And I guess that question includes whether we're going to have a Florida Bush versus Gore series of cases following the election and so on. So, Phil, what do you think November will actually turn out looking like?
Yeah, I think there are sort of one thing seems certain, which is I would not expect a major increase in voter turnout relative to the last presidential election necessarily. I think you would have to imagine there would have to be a lot of changes, I think, in law and the sort of barriers to election that might go well beyond what we are sort of likely to see in the 50 states to make that possible. Whether or not we're going to see a major drop off in turnout, I think that is something where we're going to have to look at what individual states are doing. And so that I think that's much more of an open question. I think the major concern is kind of regardless of what the turnout scenario is and what the procedures are. I think that if we're going to be having an election in the midst of a pandemic, and one of the big challenges is that creates a sort of target-rich opportunity for issues of election legitimacy or the politicization of electoral procedures. And I think it's thrusting into the spotlight officials who are not necessarily normally used to being in the spotlight, but who have an important legitimation function to perform. And so voter education sort of on the front end, but also sort of illustrating the procedures that the state has in place to ensure an accurate and fair tally of votes. These are things that states actually have to perform publicly as an almost piece of theater, as much as it is about the actual procedures of the elections. They actually have to demonstrate to people the procedures that they have to ensure the legitimacy of an election. And I think that's going to be challenging.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, last word for you about what you think November will look like. I have a suspicion you've already cleared your calendar and you have your court suits hanging waiting. But what do you think it's going to look like?
Well, I'm not comfortable making predictions with so much uncertainty swirling, but I do think people should take heart that the country has been put on notice, hopefully with adequate time to resolve a lot of these issues. I think with every lawsuit filed, both voting rights organizations and those concerns about election integrity are hammering out how to make voting in November safe and accessible and reliable. That said, I utter the election administrator's prayer daily, which is please let this election not be close, because if it is, we are in for a ride.
Yes.
Well, thank you to my wonderful guest today. Thank you all for watching and listening. As usual, we'll be broadcasting here on Twitter at noon, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Eastern Time each week. Just go to @PHLWatch or search for hashtag COVID Law Briefing. Show notes are at publichealth.org's COVID-19 briefing site, and the shows are archived by the Week in Health Law podcast at www.twill.com. The COVID-19 law and policy briefings are produced by Faith Kallick and Bethany Saxon. We'll see you next time. Wash your hands and stay safe.